Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. This article was originally published in the May 2, 2016 Wrestling Observer newsletter. Chyna, Tribute. By Dave Meltzer. Joanie Laurer, who was one of the most recognizable stars during the period that pro wrestling has its most mainstream significance in the last 60 years, best known as Chyna, was found dead on April 20th at her home in Redondo Beach, California. She was 46. Laurer worked for WWE from 1997 to 2001, but had difficulty coping with life for the 15 years after her split with the company and the end of her relationship with Paul Levesque, Triple H. She was believed to have been dead for a couple of days when found by manager Anthony Ansaldo that afternoon, who was filming a documentary on her. Ansaldo was checking on her because they hadn't heard from her in a few days. Officers were called at 3:35 p.m. after receiving a call that Laurer wasn't breathing. The death is being investigated as an accidental drug overdose. No cause of death can be determined until toxicology reports come back. No suicide note was found. There were several canisters of prescription pills, Ambien, and a drug similar to Xanax, according to Ansaldo, who in a later interview said it was Valium, found near her body. None of the canisters were empty, which was taken as an indication she wasn't attempting to kill herself. The death received a great deal of mainstream coverage for a short period of time, and an incredible amount of public curiosity. But because of the timing of Prince passing away the morning after she was found, the story didn't have much in the way of mainstream legs. Yet with almost all the coverage, almost nothing was written or said that went beneath very surface stories claiming her to have been a woman's wrestling pioneer who later appeared in some reality television shows and ended up doing porn. In recent years, she would resurface from time to make outlandish claims largely about former boyfriends Levesque and Sean Waltman, who were part of the landmark DX group in WWF during the height of the Attitude Era when the company enjoyed its highest level of mainstream interest. Among her claims were accusations of the former of being into little boys and of domestic abuse against her, and the latter of raping her, charges few took seriously and both denied. Waltman over the past year had confronted her on a radio show on her claims, where she didn't come across at all credible. At one point he was considering filing suit against her for slander because of what she had said. She had been going through a rough period with alcohol and prescription pill issues, with friends and neighbors extremely concerned about her health, even more so in recent weeks. One person close to her said she had clearly been under the influence in almost every one of their conversations for a long time. Ansaldo said that he had reached out to A&E's television show Intervention, which he was talking about as an extension of the documentary they were working on. Laurer didn't know about it, but friends of hers were aware about a week prior, with claims that names like Steve Austin and Mick Foley would be involved. Ansaldo said that she had been using Ambien and Valium for years, but in recent weeks had increased her intake to dangerous amounts and said she had been inappropriately using her prescribed medication. Ansaldo claimed that the producers of the show tried to contact her on April 18th, but at the time nobody knew that she was likely already dead. The last anyone spoke to her was on April 17th, although there was activity on her Twitter account as late as the next morning. The fame of Chyna was very much about a time and place. It would have been difficult for it to have happened sooner, and virtually impossible for it to happen today. The original gimmick was being a 5'10" woman who was the first jacked-up bodybuilder to be featured. The uniqueness worked, and as with anything in wrestling that gets popular, attempts are made to copy it. But it was about being first in the role, as the far larger and more muscular Nicole Bass, who followed, was largely a flop. WCW's attempt, Christine Wolfe, an even more muscular high-level competition bodybuilder and model billed as Asia, with the tagline that Asia was bigger than just Chyna, is barely remembered. Laurer was born Joan Marie Laurer on December 27, 1969, in Rochester, New York, the third of three girls in the family. In her autobiography, she claimed a number of issues with her parents that they denied, that a teacher sexually kissed her when she was in 7th grade and that she ran away from home at 16 when her mother tried to get her into drug rehabilitation. For nearly 3 decades she was estranged from her mother before the two reconciled, and she never reconciled with her father. She claimed to have witnessed her father stabbing her mother in the leg during a drunken rage. She claimed to have been raped by 2 men after getting drunk while attending the University of Tampa, where she graduated in 1992. Those close to her said that years later she admitted that she exaggerated the latter story. But she was both intelligent and motivated, and was able to speak multiple languages. She had a stint long after wrestling of teaching English in Japan. At one point she worked in the Peace Corps in Guatemala. Her first link with pro wrestling was at the age of 18 when she dated Ed Leslie, Brutus Beefcake, which was noted on Twitter after her death by Hulk Hogan and people were roundly skeptical of, but was confirmed to us and said later in life she had tried to hide that ever happened. She started training for pro wrestling at the age of 25 at Killer Kowalski's school in Malden, Massachusetts, which had a few years earlier produced Levesque and Perry Sotelo, Perry Saturn. Kowalski had a good reputation as a hard as well as quirky trainer, but Laurer was heavily critical of him in her book, making fun of him. Kowalski wasn't happy with the portrayal and claimed he couldn't understand it, noting that he got her the job in WWE by telling Shane McMahon that WCW was interested in her. She started wrestling as Joanie Lee in 1995, and also competed in Fitness America competitions, although never did well in those contests as her look was more conducive to hardcore bodybuilding. She hooked up with Fabulous Moolah, who got her some bookings in 1996, and she met with Levesque and Shawn Michaels at a show and they recommended her in the role of a female bodyguard for Levesque. At first Vince McMahon was negative on the idea but eventually agreed to it. He knew WCW was also pursuing her, as the Monday Night Wars were at a hot point and steroid testing had been largely thrown out the window in the quest for physical freaks. She debuted on February 16, 1997, at a pay-per-view show where she was a fan at ringside and physically manhandled Marlena, Terry Runnels, during a match with Triple H vs. Goldust. While WWE history will never acknowledge this, Levesque was a tall, good-looking guy who was a solid wrestler and it was felt had the look of a star. Ever since being signed away from WCW in early 1995, he had been given a series of pushes and his different gimmick tweaks, including hiring Playboy models to walk to the ring with him in a role as a rich snob from Greenwich, Connecticut, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, and they later put Kurt Hennig as Mr. Perfect as his manager to give him the rub from a recent legend. But he never got over to anywhere near the level of his push. That changed with the pairing with Chyna in 1997, and it exploded by the end of the year when the two were also linked with Shawn Michaels as the original Degeneration X, one of the most successful factions in history, which continued as an iconic group through many reunions long after she was gone from the company. She regularly interfered in his matches, largely using low blows on the male wrestlers. Billed as the ninth wonder of the world, because for years Andre the Giant's nickname was the eighth wonder of the world, she was a unique attraction. Her role was mostly to stand there and look freakish, whether at ringside at the matches or in the ring during the interviews. Because wrestling was positioned as more realistic than it is today, and the veterans had come through the era of protecting the business, a lot of the older and bigger male wrestlers hated to sell for her, and when they had to it was usually attacks from behind or low blows. At first there was no retribution against her, which gave her a lot of heel heat. She actually rarely wrestled. She had no matches in 1997, and only 2 matches in 1998, both on Raw, and while against men, one was a handicap match where she and Waltman faced Mark Henry, and another was an 8-person tag match where she was in very little. DX went from rebellious heels to top baby faces, and she was a major part of the act. Originally she was overly muscular, probably near 200 pounds, and pushed as anything but a sex symbol. She later got implants and after that jaw reduction surgery and dropped considerable weight and was remarketed as a large but fit woman who was pushed as a sex symbol. She eventually became a babyface and was given a role as the first woman ever to enter the Royal Rumble in 1999, and then turned heel on Triple H and aligned herself with Vince McMahon. She was also Levesque's girlfriend, at least by very early into their on-screen pairing if not earlier. Because he was a good-looking guy who had been known as a ladies' man of sorts, even back in the WCW days where he developed a major reputation in his short time with the promotion, it shocked people that the two were actually a couple. They were always together, but at first it was just figured that they were part of the same act and it was well known they were workout partners until their being a couple became known. Even so, a number of wrestlers of that era were skeptical he was really with her, thinking he was just taking the storyline deeper and trying to work everyone with the idea they were staying in the same hotel rooms. Later in 1999, Triple H turned back heel and rejoined her in storyline. At that point he had gotten significant power in the promotion as one of its biggest stars, and was being groomed to beat Steve Austin at SummerSlam that year to become WWE champion. There were several issues at the time, both Austin's reluctance to storylines and the company hiring Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura as referee, which meant a babyface needed to go over at SummerSlam. So the original plans were changed to Foley being inserted into the mix to come out of SummerSlam as champion, and then Triple H beat Foley with help from referee Shane McMahon to win the title the next night on Raw. She wrestled more frequently in 1999, but still only did 39 matches, all but 2 of which were either on television or pay-per-view. The feeling was still to not have her wrestle on house shows because she was limited, but she did wrestle men in all of those matches. There was tease for a few days that she would actually headline SummerSlam against Austin for the title, but that was never the plan. She won a three-way on the August 9, 1999, Raw show in Chicago, over Triple H and Undertaker, with Michaels as referee and Ventura as the announcer, to become the top contender. She was laid out right at the start of the match, so it was mostly Triple H versus Undertaker, until she came back with low blows on each. Undertaker came back and gave her such a soft and protected choke slam that the Chicago crowd booed the spot. The finish saw Austin hit Triple H with a chair and Chyna pinned him. The match did a 6.91 overrun rating, which even more impressively, went head-to-head with a Nitro match where Hulk Hogan and Sting and Bill Goldberg formed a trio to face Kevin Nash and Sid Vicious and Rick Steiner, which did a 4.40 overrun. But she lost that position to Foley as Mankind the next day at the SmackDown tapings in Milwaukee. Actually, she first had a singles match on that show with Triple H for the position, but Foley hit Triple H with a chair to allow Chyna to win a quick match. The decision was for her to become IC champion, beating Jeff Jarrett on October 17, 1999, at the No Mercy pay-per-view show at the Gund Arena in Cleveland. There was considerable opposition to Chyna doing singles matches with men, although at the time Vince Russo and Levesque were the key people pushing for it. After Russo left WWF for WCW, and the novelty had faded, the fans were starting to reject the idea and resented seeing her fight evenly and go over on men. It was difficult to have good matches with her, and her in-ring limitations were such that her television matches were almost always kept very short. Most of her matches were 5 minutes or less and carefully choreographed. Those inside said that she was the girlfriend of the world champion, and that's one of the perks of having that position, and she was getting protected. She did have a few matches that went longer than 10 minutes, usually against better performers like Jarrett and Chris Jericho, the two she had her most memorable singles matches against. The IC title win had its own backstory. Jarrett's contract expired on October 16, the day before the match. In the middle of a wrestling war, somehow they hadn't gotten the title off him based on a mishap regarding dates and plans, where Jim Ross, who negotiated deals at the time, ended up as the fall guy for. McMahon wasn't high on Jarrett, and the sides were far apart on money. The contract expired and it was clear that Jarrett wasn't staying, given that Russo, his political ally, had already moved to WCW. But Jarrett was still the champion. Jarrett refused to lose the title to Chyna unless McMahon would pay him $200,000 for the job. Jarrett, ever the politician, claimed he wasn't holding the company up to do the job, just that he figured with all the royalties owed since he was leaving and not signing a new deal, that he wanted to get it paid ahead of time before he'd do the job. So that's what he demanded, and got, and he agreed as part of the deal that would take care of future royalties. In a roundabout way, that led to the formation of TNA, because when WWF purchased WCW in 2001, because of this incident, Jarrett was left out in the cold like Russo, and they were involved in starting up their own promotion. To show how badly they wanted her to win the title at the time, they acquiesced. McMahon wrote the check. Jarrett, to his credit, worked a gimmick-filled match, a street fight-style weapons match billed as a good housekeeping match, that put her over great, and was possibly the best match of her career. Her program with Jericho next over the title was also the beginning of the end. Jericho, who had come from WCW earlier that year, was having to battle landmines because he came in with fanfare with the idea he was underutilized in WCW. His political foes, Levesque being the biggest, started getting the word around claiming that he didn't know how to work. Jericho's claim was that he had learned a different style and it took time to learn to adapt. But that wasn't unusual. The same people in 2000, when Chris Benoit came in with fanfare, were also talking behind his back and claiming that Benoit, one of the best in the world but in a Japanese style, also didn't know how to work. When Benoit quickly started having the best matches in the promotion and was praised by many of the other wrestlers for being excellent in the ring, the bitterness changed to the idea that Benoit was at least good enough to be carried by the right people. Jericho was used to the WCW style, which was more physical. That only made things worse because he got heat for being rough with a girl, and not just a girl, but the girlfriend of one of the biggest stars. Worse, male fans, who had been behind Chyna as a gimmick of giving guys low blows, were beginning to reject the idea of her beating the men. The crowd turned on Chyna during the Jericho program cheering the heel guy, and she lost the IC title. In 2000, she worked mostly short television matches, almost always against men, but still never wrestled on house shows. Ross booked the house shows of the era. She got a second one-week IC title run in the summer. Chyna in late 2000 was put together with Eddie Guerrero. At this point she'd been remade as a sex symbol. Guerrero was an excellent wrestler, as good as anyone in the company at the time, but had a reputation as being shy and not entertaining. The pairing was originally put together as a practical joke to make fun of Guerrero, who was really only 5'6.5", and they'd use camera angles to make the height difference between the two even more exaggerated. But both ended up shining in the role. Guerrero became a personality and Chyna went for her role as the stoic bodyguard to a woman who became almost endearing in the way she handled the affection. It also helped her popularity as she had posed for Playboy as the cover girl in the November 2000 issue, which became among the best-selling issues the magazine had done in years. There was a famous story at the time, because within WWF, there had always been the issues that for whatever reason, the women stars were far more difficult to deal with than the men. The line always given was that when the women started to get stardom, it would become far more unreasonable. Although the flip side is there was also a double standard in the sense that if a male star studied the business and complained, depending on how high on the card they were, their opinions would be listened to or at the least tolerated. If a woman star thought creative made no sense, it was viewed very differently. At first, when Chyna became a star, her reputation was that unlike Sunny and Sable, who ended up constantly at odds with the company after they became public sex symbols, that Chyna never had those issues. It was remarked how even after shooting Playboy that she was largely the same nice person she was when she first came in as a nobody a few years earlier. One person with the company remarked about how, unlike the others, they thought she wouldn't change after all the publicity that came with being on the cover. Jack Lanza was listening, took a puff out of his cigarette, paused for a few seconds, and said, "Magazine hasn't come out yet." Lanza was later referred to like Nostradamus by the person because the feeling was everything started to change when the magazine came out, just like he had predicted. The decision was made to break up the Guerrero/Chyna pairing shortly after the magazine came out. Off the screen, things were a lot stranger. It was well known in wrestling that Levesque and Stephanie McMahon were a couple. That's why during this period, it stunned people when Chyna went on the Howard Stern show and talked about her boyfriend, Triple H, and sexual exploits, as virtually everyone had figured they had broken up months earlier. With Triple H having moved on, her protection was gone. By the end of 2000, the decision was made to no longer allow her to wrestle against men. The feeling was it was an experiment that really didn't work. She was vehemently against the decision. She claimed it was going backwards having to wrestle women, and she didn't like selling for the other women. She thought she should get a run as world champion, which the company thought was ludicrous, particularly since they never wanted her wrestling on house shows because she'd have to regularly do matches not so carefully choreographed. At some point while all this was going on, she found love letters from Stephanie in Triple H's bag which led to them breaking up, long after everyone had thought they were broken up. She then committed political suicide, not understanding the situation, and stepped right on a landmine. She went to Vince McMahon, who unbeknownst to her had encouraged his daughter to get together with Triple H, and complained about how it was unprofessional for a woman in management to be dating talent. Essentially, she was doomed, but she was also such a big star that firing her on the spot if the story got out would make them look horrible. At WrestleMania in 2001, she defeated Ivory, Lisa Moretti, in 239 to capture the women's title in what was essentially a squash match. It was only her second match of the year. There was a reason, even though the company knew they were getting rid of her, to put the title on her on the biggest show of the year. The plan was to put the title on her, since she had far more credibility as a star than any of the women on the roster, then have her drop the title to Lita, who they were positioning as the new upcoming cool tomboy-like pretty girl, with the idea that Lita beating Chyna for the title would do more to elevate her than anything else possible. Then Chyna would be phased out by not renewing her contract. On May 20, 2001, at the Judgment Day pay-per-view in Sacramento, the match was to take place. Chyna didn't sell much and retained the title. Since the plans were not exactly secret, the only thing said to be about it right after was that Chyna outworked Lita, essentially took advantage of Lita's political naivete, and Lita agreed to lose even though the company wanted her to come out of it as champion. Chyna never worked another match for the company, so she never did drop the title on her way out. WWE officials said that Chyna was asking for Steve Austin or Rock-type money, a near $1 million downside, and still wanted to have much of the week off to do auditions. Like with the other women who gained fame from a best-selling Playboy cover, she was now considered marketable and was getting offers and lip service from people in Hollywood. She also made far more money posing in Playboy than she had ever made being a star in pro wrestling. WWE took the tack that her demands were outrageous and stopped negotiating, sent her a fax that her services were no longer needed. They immediately got the word out that she was done with the company due to outrageous demands for a new deal. In reality, she was going to be gone no matter what her demands were. After being let go, she appeared on the short-lived TV show Celebrity Boxing on Fox, a network show that drew more viewers than even Raw did in its heyday. More than 12 million viewers, a gain of 2 million viewers from the prior fight and a monster number for the Fox network at the time, saw a spectacle that it's almost hard to conceive was allowed. Wearing oversized gloves and boxing headgear, she attempted to slug it out, but was ragdolled and punched out, losing to an unskilled 46-year-old car mechanic named Joey Buttafuoco in the show's main event. It became an embarrassment within wrestling and WWE that they had booked main event guys to fight even with her, and booked their undercard guys to put her over quickly, when a somewhat overweight middle-aged non-athlete threw her around like it was nothing. For the next 15 years, she dropped in and out of the news, largely as a sad former celebrity. Whether she ever got over the relationship breakup is unknown. At times she lashed out at him. She made a lot of money in 2002 doing her second Playboy shoot, and bought herself a home. She built a pool in the backyard, which she had designed to look like the shape of Levesque's ass. She later had a relationship with Waltman, one of Levesque's best friends. To call it stormy would be an understatement. During the period both had major drug issues, which she denied and he after the fact, has readily admitted. At one time he had to call the police because she had attacked him in front of his kids. She was released. He complained that she showed no remorse for anything she did, and that no matter what she did, she never had to suffer any repercussions for it. When she appeared on the TV show Surreal Life, in 2005, she was drinking heavily, spent the entire filming of the show complaining about him, and he showed up on the set during the filming. She had a few more forays into pro wrestling after WWF let her go. Even after the celebrity boxing debacle, Antonio Inoki took a shine to her and thought he could build her into a major attraction beating the male wrestlers in New Japan. She was brought to New Japan Pro Wrestling and did an angle where Inoki, at this point 59 years old, was in the ring, and his big rival from the 70s, Tiger Jeet Singh, came to attack him and Chyna acted as his bodyguard and threw Singh out of the ring. But the idea didn't work. She was brought to Japan for the tour that started on September 6, 2002, mostly to work tags where her time in would be limited. Future UFC fighter Justin McCulley was brought in to be her policeman in tag team matches in case one of the male wrestlers wanted to make a point by not selling for her. The idea was to keep her strong and she was given a monster push. The uniqueness of a woman facing men in the New Japan ring garnered a lot of media and curiosity, since she was an American star. But it didn't sell tickets and the fan base wasn't buying it. There was little reaction to her matches and her limited in-ring ability stood out even more in that company, even though it was during the decline of the promotion. They built her up for a singles match with Masahiro Chono on the October 14, 2002, show at the Tokyo Dome, where she lost via submission with the STF. The match was positioned as a major part of the show, put third from the top on a 14-match show which drew 38,000 fans. She was underneath a Yuji Nagata vs Kazuyuki Fujita IWGP title match main event and a singles match with Bob Sapp vs Manabu Nakanishi. In her other big match before no longer being booked, she teamed with Great Kabuki and losing to Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan in an IWGP Tag Team title match 2 weeks later. By that point the experiment was already deemed a failure, and she only did one more match with New Japan. She did 6 porn movies, starting with the release of a 2004 sex tape with Waltman. She would claim that it was a leaked tape that got out without her permission, and she was never paid for it. Later it came out she had been in negotiations, there were signed contracts and she was paid significant money from it. The tape sold more than 100,000 copies. It was so successful that in 2006 it got an Adult Video News Award as the best-selling sex tape of the year. This led to her doing 5 more sex tapes between 2009 and 2013, including one that parodied the WWE with characters that were supposed to be Vince and Stephanie McMahon. She had always tried to maintain the image of the Chyna character. She fought tooth and nail with WWE over the rights to the name, which led to her at one point legally changing her name to Chyna Doll to allow her the usage. Dr. Keith Abloh, a Fox News contributor and psychiatrist, who never treated her, noted the dichotomy issues where she played a certain character in pro wrestling. If your job is adopting a persona who is not really who you are and maintaining it for many years inside and outside the ring to some extent, one could wonder whether you are also more vulnerable to using substances to try to maintain that identity. This could be an unhealthy alliance of certain psychological features with the fallout from physical side effects that result when you try to maintain a false, hyperbolic image of yourself. Indeed, long after she was done playing the role, she would insist she'd physically beat up Waltman or that she used to be able to bench press more than Levesque, while being in denial of ever having used steroids or that she had any recreational drug issues. She also did an appearance for TNA in 2011. The idea was that she would be Kurt Angle's secret new girlfriend for a feud with Jarrett and Kurt's former wife Karen Jarrett. The girlfriend part was quickly dropped, and after the pay-per-view, due to problems, she was never used again. She went to Japan and was teaching there. This led to an announcement that she had just gotten engaged to her longtime Japanese boyfriend and would be returning to the US. That became more strange with a claim days later that several more people had asked her to marry them and she had to make a choice on who to marry. She never ended up talking about it again. When returning, she sought validation, with a documentary and a push to get into the WWE Hall of Fame. The WWE avoided her like the plague. She tried to film at the WWE offices. She attempted to talk with Levesque outside in the parking lot at Roddy Piper's funeral in Portland. She told friends that in 2011 she had written to Ann Russo-Gordon at WWE asking for help for rehab and they never responded. Her credibility on almost everything is questionable, so it should be taken with a grain of salt. WWE did not answer whether there was any veracity to her ever asking for help. Last year, after Steve Austin directly asked Levesque on his podcast about her being in the Hall of Fame, Levesque tried to politically maneuver away from the subject and talked about how if his kids Googled her name, they would see the connection to the pornographic tapes. This led to her responding in an interview with Vince Russo, making accusations against Levesque, including that he hit her in a domestic fight, which he quickly denied. Russo had tried to push Lucha Underground into bringing her in after talking with Konnan. The deal wasn't made, and when Konnan said that he said she didn't fit, Russo said he was just trying to help her. She had a number of embarrassing public spectacles when under the influence, notably a 2007 appearance on Larry King Live where she was apparently messed up talking about the death of her friend, Anna Nicole Smith. But then friends of Smith claimed that the two knew each other but were not friends, although the two did party together and were in a movie together. She had an even worse appearance on Howard Stern. She also appeared on the Nancy Grace Show after the Benoit murders, where she claimed that everyone in pro wrestling had used steroids, except herself. She later said she was battling depression and had stopped drinking. She did the TV show Celerity Rehab in 2008, largely due to pleading by Waltman, who wrote, "This is a critical time for you and anyone else who has profited from doing business with her to step up and help save this woman's life. She is on the losing end of a life or death battle with drugs and alcohol, along with severe mental illness." While on the show, even though she appeared to be the worst off of any of the celebrities in the cast, she insisted that she didn't know why she was there because she didn't have a problem. There was an apparent suicide attempt after Christmas in 2008 when she cut up her arm. She was hospitalized from an overdose in 2010. Steve Hirsch of Vivid Video stated that the two had scheduled negotiations where she would return and do more porn movies just before her death. She had told friends that all of her money was gone and she was living on a combination of Social Security and whatever royalty checks she was getting from WWE, which by this point amounted to very little. "We were scheduled to meet this week to discuss future films," said Hirsch, a longtime pro wrestling fan who founded the company, to the New York Post. "She was popular and we wanted to work with her again. But in the end, in wrestling, it was the unreal part that she was remembered for. The woman who competed with and beat men in the ring, was an intercontinental champion, and paved the way for all the women in wrestling today. The reality was more that it was a time and a place, and that was really it. There were women stars in wrestling before her. As far as women's wrestling went, she had less than a dozen actual women's matches, all long after her character had peaked. While the Chyna character was absolutely successful for its time, and was copied, none of her successors ever made a dent. The women characters in wrestling after her were modeled as the antithesis of her original gimmick. Women chosen almost entirely based on being thin and pretty. The modern pro wrestling version of women really should trace its resurrection after being discarded on trainer Fit Finlay, who pushed the model types to actually test themselves and learn wrestling, and the independent scene, where fans respected women who were wrestlers first and foremost. If anything, the people who brought back women's characters in wrestling that endured were the popularity of Sunny and even more Sable, because they were the prototypes over who was being hired for women roles over the next decade, with the Divas branding of the women being almost the exact opposite of the role she played. Larger women, in fact, weren't considered, as a young Kia Stevens, who became Amazing Kong and Awesome Kong, was never even considered for a WWE role even after she became a star in Japan, until long after proving herself in TNA. Similarly, Jessica Cresso was easily the most over woman in OVW years ago, and never got even a developmental contract as she didn't fit what they were looking for. The change came when the decision was made, in Florida a few years back, to stop discouraging the newer women who wanted to work the same as guys from doing so. Today's women wrestlers being focused on differently was far more based on the marketing success of Ronda Rousey. The role now is that women, still chosen greatly based on looks and bodies, to put far more emphasis on the ability to work an athletic style in the ring, and being held to standards more similar to the men. And the drug testing programs in place make it a virtual impossibility today to have a character like that. WWE made an attempt of sorts with Linda Miles, the tall and muscular former college basketball power forward who did some modeling as Shaniqua. But she also ended up barely a footnote in history. Currently, they're grooming Dwayne Johnson's cousin, who goes as Nia Jax, as a larger bruiser-type woman as a contrast to the smaller women, but her role is more of an adaptation of Awesome Kong than Chyna. Chyna did do singles matches against men, something that more than a decade later became an in thing on the indies and is used on Lucha Underground, but few remember that they were generally not considered successes at the time, aside from the Jarrett match, and it hurt her popularity in the long run because the male fan base thought it was too much and were starting to turn on her, and the decision was made to nix them. Both her rise and her fall were actually more political in nature than anything. As much fame as she had, she was unable to parlay that into any kind of a career in wrestling after being let go, because it was all about a time and a place. And unfortunately, she struggled to cope with it the rest of her life because that time and place were over. She sought validation in a Hall of Fame that didn't want her when alive for fear she would embarrass it, but due to public sentiment, will also almost surely accept her now when that is no longer the case. The sad part is that what she really wanted in the end she will likely get, and had to die to get it. The sad part is that it's all an extension of a make-believe world. Mick Foley wrote about that subject this past week, noting that he had spoken to her and knew she was going to push for getting into the WWE Hall of Fame, and he wasn't sure she was emotionally ready for it. "Joanie," I said, "being inducted into the Hall of Fame was one of the greatest nights of my life, but it doesn't define me. Don't let it define you. You're a legend in our business. No one can ever take away from Y9 the things you've done. Don't let anyone have the power to tell you whether or not your career was worthy of the Hall of Fame. It was. There will never be another Chyna." Foley then wrote, "So next year, when the announcements are made, if Chyna is not an inductee, don't be sad. The real Hall of Fame is inside all of us. It's a Hall of Fame based on the way superstars made us feel, the smiles they produced, the memories they created for us, the legacies they forged that will stand the test of time. By that standard, Joanie Laurer, Chyna, the ninth wonder of the world, was inducted into the hall that really matters, our Hall of Memories, a long time ago." But Foley's best real story was not of a scripted moment, or of her post-wrestling career's trauma, but of her when she wasn't so busy playing and trying to live up to fictitious world of the character Chyna. "I'll always be grateful for the friendship I shared with her," he wrote, "but particularly so for the kindness she showed my children, especially Noelle, when she was younger. I will never forget those moments where Joanie would take Noelle by the hand at WWE events in the late 90s, off to have her makeup done, her fingernails painted, bonding time between big, strong Joanie and her tiny sidekick. A father doesn't forget that type of kindness." Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,